All right, you guys, this is an introductory video to photosynthesis, and I just want to talk about a few things like the chloroplast and some properties of light and the overall equation for photosynthesis to get us started in this chapter here. So one thing to consider is that it's amazing that the sun has so much energy. As a matter of fact, only 5% of energy actually hits the Earth is absorbed and used in photosynthesis. So there's just this abundant amount of energy that we have from the sun. It's a great renewable energy source. It's an unlimited, pretty much untapped energy source that humans are definitely trying to do a better job of capturing and powering our planet with, because we do have a very high energy demand, and the sun can really provide us with everything we need. So a little bit of an overview of photosynthesis. The goal of photosynthesis is to make food. Photosynthesis is done by autotrophs. Autotroph means that they automatically make their own food. And so the goal is to make sugar from carbon dioxide. So autotrophs are going to take carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, out of the air. They're going to use that sunlight energy, and they're going to make sugar out of that. So sunlight is what powers the electron transport chain in photosynthesis to make ATP. In cellular respiration, it was the electron donors that were powering the electron transport chain, NADH and FADH2. Those were powering the electron transport chain in cellular respiration. However, in photosynthesis, sunlight is powering the electron transport chain. And that really provides a lot of ATP, just like the electron transport chain helps to provide a lot of ATP from oxidative phosphorylation. There's a lot of ATP that can be made because of photosynthesis by absorbing that sunlight. So where does this occur? Sunlight is absorbed in the chloroplast. That's a membrane-bound organelle that's found in plant cells. Specifically, it's found in the leaf cells on the surface closest to the sky, I guess, that's facing upwards towards the sun. Where exactly? It's happening in the thylakoid space found within the chloroplast, which we'll go over in just a second. The equation for photosynthesis is right here. Sunlight and CO2 and water are joined, or I guess the energy from sunlight is captured in photosynthesis to help take carbon dioxide and water and put them together to form glucose and oxygen. So really, if you look closely, glucose and 6 oxygen are the products of photosynthesis. 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters are the reactants in photosynthesis. This is just the opposite to cellular respiration. Okay, so again, those small molecules of carbon dioxide, remember, each carbon dioxide has 1 carbon in it, and we're going to capture those carbon dioxides to produce a glucose, and a glucose has 6 carbons inside. So we need to capture 6 1-carbon carbon dioxides to make 1 6-carbon glucose. This reaction is endothermic. It stores energy, so we need to, I guess, it absorbs energy from the surroundings. It's a very energy expensive process. It's not a spontaneous reaction. It's something that requires a lot of energy. The carbon dioxide, it's a carbon dioxide requiring process. And again, it uses light energy, which are known as photons. Photons are pieces of light. If you're in physics or you've taken some physics, you'll understand that a photon is both a particle and a wave, but it carries energy with it. And plants are absorbing that energy from the photon. And it also uses water to produce a carbohydrate, glucose, which is a monosaccharide. Okay, again, here we go. Here's the formula down here. We've got our 6 carbon dioxides and 6 waters are going to make 1 glucose and 6 oxygen molecules, and that's going to require photons or sunlight energy, solar energy, to do that. Here's a little bit about the structure of the leaf. And you can see here the leaf is really divided into some specific layers. And so the layers that you need to know are the cuticle, the epidermis, the mesophyll cells, the stoma, and the guard cells. And so on the surface, on either surface, the top surface and the bottom surface, you actually get a waxy layer called the cuticle. And you can see it right here. That's the waxy layer called the cuticle. It's that thin layer right near the top there. And there's also a cuticle along the bottom. And it's got wax, and really its job is to preserve the water inside the leaf. So it's to help it from losing water and protect it a little bit. The second layer is the epidermis, and so right below that is the epidermal cells. Epidermis really is refers to the skin. We have our skin cells are also called the epidermis, and so these are the epidermal cells here. And there's a top layer and a bottom layer of epidermal cells. And then where the business really happens is these mesophyll cells. We've got the top ones up here, they're called the palisade mesophyll, and down here these are called the spongy mesophyll because there's more space between them. But you can just call them the mesophyll cells. And this is where all the chlorophyll and the chloroplasts and the photosynthesis really happens, is in these mesophyll cells. They're just packed full of chloroplasts. The majority of photosynthesis, or the most concentrated amount of mesophyll cells, are going to be near the surface, the top surface of the leaf, because that's where the light is hitting first. You don't want to have them deep in the leaf, because then a lot of the sunlight will get absorbed. If you put them closer to the surface where the sun is, the sunny side of the leaf, then the photosynthesis process will be a lot more efficient. So they're packed right at the top there. So that's called the mesophyll. And then over here, these here are kind of like the blood vessels of the leaf. They're called the xylem and the phloem. The xylem is, what color did they label the xylem here? The xylem transports water, so it's probably blue. Yeah. So the blue one here is the xylem, and so this is transporting water from the roots to the leaves. And that water is really important in the process of photosynthesis because we have to combine carbon dioxide and water to make sugar. Remember, carbohydrate, carbon and water, carbohydrate. And so we need that water that gets brought up from the roots through the xylem tubes here. And then these ones here, the yellow ones, are the phloem tubes, and these ones are actually bringing the sugars back down to the roots and storing the sugars for use later. So usually find like the sap or like a sticky liquid is in the phloem, and so that sticky liquid it's sticky because it contains sugar, glucose. We also need carbon dioxide from the air, and we need to release oxygen back into the atmosphere as a byproduct of photosynthesis, and that happens through these little pores. A pore is a tiny hole, and the pores of the leaf are called the stoma. Not to be confused with the stroma. The stroma is in a chloroplast. That's the inside of the chloroplast. It's like the matrix of the chloroplast, right? Don't say that. Don't confuse those. But it's the inside of the chloroplast. The stoma is the pore, the little hole that lets gases in and out. Water vapor, oxygen and carbon dioxide move in and out of those stoma pores. And then around that, there's two cells called the guard cells, and their job is to open when the cell requires, or when the conditions are favorable and water loss is not a concern. Then those stoma can be open. The guard cells can open the stoma. But if the plant is ever feeling like it's not got enough water, it needs to preserve its water, then it can close those stoma, and that will keep water inside the leaf, because water will leave out through those pores, just like we lose water out of our skin pores. So the guard cells open when water is plentiful, and they close when water is scarce. Let's take a little bit of a closer look at the chloroplast. So there's lots of structures within the chloroplast. the chloroplast has a double membrane. It's got an inner and an outer membrane, and that inner and outer membrane doesn't serve the same function as the mitochondria, but it definitely is one of the pieces of evidence that there was some sort of endosymbiosis relationship between bacteria and early eukaryotes. This kind of, or gives supports the claim that chloroplasts came from bacteria, especially since there's circular DNA and smaller ribosomes inside. That's part of the evidence of endosymbiotic theory, which you can go and do a little bit more research on yourself if you're interested. But then, if we want to get down to the business end of the chloroplast, we want to look at the thylakoids. And so I guess the thylakoids are these they look like stacks of coins. And a stack of coins is called a granum. So I'm just trying to get my cursor to work here. So here's a thylakoid, here's a thylakoid, here's a thylakoid. And all of these thylakoids are surrounded by a phospholipid bilayer. And so they've got that membrane around them. And the inside of the thylakoid is just called the thylakoid space. And then outside of the thylakoids and within the inner membrane is called the stroma. So again, don't confuse that with the stoma, the pore of the leaf. This is called the stroma. Like I said, a chloroplast has its own ribosomes. It has its own genetic information. Chloroplasts are able to divide and replicate on their own when conditions are favorable. So as I was mentioning, there is this connecting piece between the thylakoids within the granum, and that really is just to connect one granum stack to another stack of thylakoids, and that probably just allows for some flow of products and reactants within those chemical reactions of photosynthesis, and just some sharing of substances to make sure that the entire chloroplast has everything that it needs. But we'll really focus on the thylakoid membrane and the thylakoid space and the stroma when we talk about the light-dependent reactions and the Calvin cycle. All right, so question for you is, why are plants green? And you may have heard that light is actually a wave, and it's a particle and a wave, and that particle of light is called a photon. And those photons can have different wavelengths. The shorter the wavelength, the shorter the wavelength, the more energy it has, and the longer the wavelength, the less energy it has. And so the wavelength corresponds to the amount of energy that it has. It also corresponds to the color of light. And so we see a very small piece of all the different possible wavelengths of light, and we call this the visible spectrum, or the rainbow of colors, or Roy G. Biv, or whatever you're familiar with. But it ranges from violet all the way to red. So it goes through kind of violet, indigo, blue, green, yellow, orange, and red. And those all correspond to a specific wavelength of light. Now there's wavelengths beyond the light that we can see, and that is if it's on the violet side, if it's beyond the violet, then we call that the ultraviolet light. And if it's beyond the red, then we call that the infrared light. And so types of infrared light are infrared, which is kind of like heat. If you have the heat goggles on and you can see people at night vision goggles rely on infrared. Microwave and radio waves are all well beyond the infrared. And then on the other side of that, we've got the ultraviolet, or you might have heard of like UVA, UVB. UV stands for ultraviolet. And then there's X-rays, which we use for medical imaging. And then there's gamma rays, which are really dangerous. All of these are ultraviolet, X-rays, and gamma rays are all very dangerous for our bodies. They can destroy our DNA because they have such high energy. but those are increasing energy. So the lowest energy would be the radio waves. The highest energy would be these gamma rays over here. And the visible spectrum is, I guess, somewhere in the middle. Not necessarily exactly the middle, but the visible light is what we can see. So like I said, the wavelength of light determines its color. The longest wavelengths are red that we can see. The longest visible wavelengths that we can see are red. They have the lowest energy. And the light with longer wavelengths are the infrared, and they have even lower energy. So the lowest energy there that we talked about was the radio waves. The shortest waves that we can see, the shortest visible waves that we can see are violet or blue, like a really dark blue, and they have the highest energy. So lights with shorter wavelengths called ultraviolet and the X-rays and the gamma rays have even more energy, higher and higher energy. So how does this relate to photosynthesis and to plants? Well, plants contain a pigment, and a pigment is just a color essentially, and there are three things that can happen to light when it interacts with a substance, when it interacts with matter. So the first thing is absorption. So if light hits a substance, some matter, that matter can actually absorb the photon and gain its energy. All right. The other thing that can happen is transmission. Transmission is when light does not interact and it just goes right through. And then reflection is when light is released from matter. So matter will absorb that photon and then it will release it as reflection. And so this is happening all the time in stuff that we see. That's why we see the colors that we see. Light is absorbed and then it's reflected. That's why some things are, light goes right through them. And so those are the properties of kind of how light interact, or the possibilities of how light can interact with matter. Either they are absorbed and the matter will gain energy. Either they just go right through the matter, they don't interact with the matter, they pass right through. The photon will pass right through the matter. Or the photon is released from matter, and that the matter will then lose energy. So the pigment that you are probably familiar with in plants is the green pigment called chlorophyll. And so a pigment is just a compound that can absorb certain wavelengths of color, and it reflects other wavelengths of light. Plants absorb all the colors that are coming from the sun. So they absorb blue, they absorb red, orange, and yellow, but they don't absorb green light. They actually reflect green light. And so that's why we see green as the plant color. That's why plants are typically green. If a plant is purple like this one here, then it's absorbing green and it's reflecting the violet. Or maybe it's also reflecting the green, but it's also reflecting violet or blue, and that's why we see these bright purple colors in plants sometimes. And so this one here might be absorbing the reds, but that's the reds and oranges, but it's reflecting the greens and blues. But typically plants look green, right? Plants look green. And that's because they reflect the green light, and that's what our eyes see. That's what enters our eyes, and our brains perceive that as green. All right, so then the pigment that we find in plants is called chlorophyll, and chlorophyll is found in the thylakoid membrane of the chloroplast, and it kind of looks like a phospholipid because it really needs to. It needs to have this lipid tail here to stick itself into the thylakoid membrane, which, as we talked about earlier, is a phospholipid bilayer. So it needs to interact with this hydrophobic lipid interior of the thylakoid membrane. And so this lipid tail is able to do that. It's able to stick into the thylakoid membrane, and then the this huge carbon and nitrogen ring that has a magnesium at the center is able to face outward, and the magnesium is responsible for actually absorbing the photon. It interacts with the photons of light. It's able to absorb the light and get energy from that. And so there are two types of chlorophyll in plants. There's chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. Both of them absorb light, just like we discussed, but they absorb slightly different wavelengths. Remember, they do not absorb green light, and we can look at something called an absorption spectrum to see what wavelengths of light they absorb. So here is a picture of the absorption spectrum, and we can see we've got these different lines on the graph here. And so here's chlorophyll A, and here's chlorophyll B, and you can see that they take up most of the violet and the blue light, right? They absorb most of the violet and the blue light. But you can see that their absorption drops off. In other words, they stop absorbing photons when the photon wavelength becomes green and even a little bit yellow. But then they start absorbing through the orange and the red wavelengths of light as well. And so this is why plants appear green, because chlorophyll does not absorb that green, yellow, and orange light. What else do we have here? So, now, there are other pigments other than chlorophyll, but these are not responsible for photosynthesis. There are other pigments like the carotenoids. So you might have heard of beta-carotene, I'm not really sure, but the carotenoids are responsible for the yellow or orange colored color of leaves that we see in the fall. And xanthophylls are responsible for the yellow. Anthocyanins are responsible for red. So these kind of give us the yellow, orange, red colors that we see on leaves in the fall time as the temperatures get cooler. And what happens is that as the temperatures get cooler, plants take this as a stimulus that the amount of sunlight is about to decrease over the winter time. And so what they actually start to do is prepare their structures to kind of go dormant or go to sleep through the winter time, and they take away their chlorophylls, which ends up or they stop producing their chlorophylls, which means that the other pigments start to become a lot more visible through the leaf. So we start to see the oranges and the reds and the yellows underneath the greens that were being reflected so much. So that's kind of why we see the change of colors go from green to yellow to red in the fall time. It's because the plant is preparing to go to sleep for the winter, it's preparing to become dormant, and it stops producing its chlorophyll A and chlorophyll B. This is an interesting experiment here that was done a long time ago before scientists were able to actually measure specific wavelengths. What this gentleman did, his name is Engelmann, what he did is he used a prism to break light into its individual colors, into its spectrum. And what he did is he shined that light through a tube that contained this algae here, this photosynthetic algae. And the algae was doing photosynthesis. And of course, one of the products of photosynthesis is oxygen. And so that oxygen would then diffuse, it would move out of the tube into sort of like a jelly over here that contained some bacteria that required oxygen. And so the bacteria were able to grow wherever oxygen was being produced the most. And what he found was that the largest amounts of bacteria were in the blue parts of the wavelengths or the spectrum and the red wavelengths of the spectrum. But he found that very few bacteria grew in the green parts of the spectrum because photosynthesis wasn't happening as fast here. So not as much oxygen was being produced in the green wavelengths of light as it was in the blue and the red. So the bacteria that required oxygen were able to grow where the blue light was shining on the photosynthetic algae that was because they were producing, or because the photosynthesis was able to happen here and was able to produce oxygen that was able to grow the bacteria. Same thing over here. The red light was being absorbed by the chloroplasts over here, and so the photosynthetic algae was able to do photosynthesis with the red light and produce oxygen, which the bacteria then used to grow and divide. So this was a really interesting and very clever experiment that was done a long, long time ago, and we now know that it's because the pigment chlorophyll absorbs blue light and red light, but it reflects green light. All right, so that's the end of this talk on Introduction to Photosynthesis. I hope you have a bit of a better understanding of wavelengths and the pigments and the structures that are responsible for photosynthesis, and we're going to do a deep dive into the process of photosynthesis next.